Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. We're going to, this afternoon, talk about how to put HR back in control of GDPR, or making sure that HR have got all the processes and procedures in place and know exactly what they need to do in relation to GDPR. Now, as we go through the webinar today, there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to answer questions or have your questions answered at the end. You'll notice that in the GoToWebinar application, there's actually a space to answer questions, and I'd encourage you to ask those as you go along, as you think about them. Please don't be shy about asking those questions. Ask as many questions as you like, and we'll try to get to all of them actually on the webinar. But if we don't actually get to answer all of them during the course of this webinar, we will of course make those answers available after the event if we run out of time. So today I'm very pleased to be providing and hosting this webinar along with Exede. Now Exede, for those of you who are not aware, are actually a developer and provider of HR systems and services. So very, very pleased to be undertaking and presenting this webinar along with them. And Chris Mitford-Slade should be joining us in a little while, and he'll be talking about some of the ways that Exede actually helps people, helps you with meeting your GDPR compliance and requirements. A couple of points, housekeeping points. We're going to make sure that everyone is aware today about some GDPR terminology and a little bit about the background of GDPR, just to make sure there's a level setting and make sure there's some good information there for everyone to understand. We're also going to be covering off 5 steps to help ensuring that HR departments have control of GDPR. And we're also going to talk about where to get some further information. We've got plenty of time, as I've already mentioned, for questions at the end, and the webinar will also be recorded. So we'll be making this webinar available after the event, both as a video and also as a podcast. So if you'd like to subscribe to the 5th Step podcast, there'll be details at the end of this webinar about how to do that. But if you go to www.5thstep.com and go to the 5th Sense section of our website, you'll be able to find that and subscribe and find out all the other podcasts and webinars that we've run previously. Well, let's make a start and start talking a little bit about the background of GDPR. Now, many people perhaps do realise, or some perhaps won't, that actually GDPR is a new regulation, but based on the Data Protection Directive, which is another piece of European regulation for data privacy and data privacy. Now, that dates back to 1998, but actually, both of those pieces of regulation, GDPR and the DPD, have their roots back in the first Data Protection Act, which dates back to 1984, would you believe? So it's quite a long time ago that the UK first implemented one of the first data protection laws. Now, bringing you up to date though, the GDPR enforcement begins on May 25th. That's actually 28 days today at point of recording for those of you listening after the event. So only 28 days now until enforcement begins. Now, the jurisdiction of GDPR, and this has always been a little bit of a new aspect, or is a new aspect to GDPR, is that it's an extraterritorial regulation. So that means anyone processing European private and personal data has to make sure that they are compliant, irrespective of their location. So 5th Step often deals with organisations in many different parts of the world, and many of those, their HR departments, for example, are perhaps centralised. Perhaps they're centralised in Europe, but perhaps not. Perhaps they're centralised in the USA, for example. And that means that they have to comply with the GDPR rules in the same way as any other organisation based in the UK or Europe. The maximum fines. Now, these are the things that organisations tend to focus on, and has certainly focused the attention of some of the larger organisations. And that is the fines, and they can be the greater of 4% of the annual global revenue, or $17 million, 17 million pounds, 20 million euros, and that's approximately 24 just over $24 million at the moment. So GDPR has long arms. It can reach, around the globe, and it also has sharp teeth in the forms of the penalties and the fines that can be levied. GDPR, though, by no stretch of the imagination, is it the only data protection and data privacy requirement around the world? It's certainly not. And here's a map showing some details of some of the regulation that's in place. And now it's important to mention that not all regulation is equal. And just because I'm showing a flag there, it doesn't mean that the data protection regulation in China, for example, is exactly the same as GDPR. It's most certainly not, but there are some similarities. So that's something to be aware of. If you're a multinational organization, putting all these pieces of regulation together so that you have one overarching control or overarching controls for data protection, data privacy, can be something that's quite daunting, but that's something that Fifth Step's actually developed quite a talent for. So if you are facing those kind of challenges or interested in knowing more about that, then do please reach out to us. I'm more than happy to talk to you about that. Okay, let's start talking about some of the terminology. I'll whiz through some of these because some of you will be aware of it, and those who are not aware, hopefully I've simplified it in such a way as to make it relatively simple for newcomers to pick up. But some of this terminology, when you first come across it, will is confusing for those who haven't been involved in European data protection before. So we're talking about personal data, and personal data is anything that identifies an individual. Now that can be directly, so it can be a passport number, for example, or a credit card number or a bank account number. Any of those things would be pieces of information that would identify an individual, but it can also be unstructured data, so data that doesn't at first, the first flush sound like it's personal data. So an example that I often use is the man who lives at 12 the High Street who owns a red Porsche. Now, some might say, oh, well, that's not personal information because, because you're not giving the person's name away. Sure, you're giving an address away, but you're only saying it's the man, so it's not an individual. But think about it from the perspective of if there's only one man who lives at 12 the High Street, or if there's only one Porsche owner, or indeed one red Porsche owner, or in fact only one person living at 12 the High Street. Those kind of things would make that rather unstructured data into personal data. So you have to be quite careful about how you understand and segment and protect your personal data, and indeed identify it. So on the right-hand side, there's some examples there of the common types of personal data. So name, employee ID, employee appraisals. Employee appraisals are important because they express an opinion about an individual. And some of the others there, bank account numbers, IP addresses. So when you log on to the internet, you're giving an IP address. That is now classified as personal data, personal information. Sensitive personal data is another category of personal data, and it tends to be, I tend to think about it as being the kind of data that people have historically been persecuted for. So it's things like ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, sexuality, those kinds of things. They're all aspects of personal data or sensitive personal data that are important to differentiate between and make sure that you're guarding and that you're treating slightly differently. So you have to make sure that you absolutely need sensitive personal data. It's not something that you can just say, oh well, we just want to collect it. Okay, it has to be treated differently and kept particularly safe. And new to the GDPR is the addition of biometric and genetic information, which is added as part of the GDPR. So if you have some very fancy biometric a security system that recognizes people's fingerprints or does facial recognition or recognizes irises or something far-fetched like that, then it may be that you need to look at that from the perspective of it capturing and storing biometric information. The purpose or purposes for which data is collected and processed is a really important aspect behind the GDPR. It really goes to the transparency that is required by data processors and data controllers under the GDPR. So it's likely that you'll have more than one purpose as part of your compliance with the GDPR. You'll have at least one for the provision of your service, you know, whatever that may be that you're transacting, assuming you're a business. If you're a charity, for example, you'll have a statement of your privacy statement will be tailored towards that. You'll also have, or quite possibly have, a purpose that will be tailored towards recruitment. So you're treating data differently when you're recruiting someone as opposed to when they've actually been hired and they're working for you, or indeed during the course of them being a customer of yours. And you'll also have a purpose around the provision of employment. You may have others as well. These are just some of the common ones that exist and that most organizations will have purposes defined around those three. But as I say, they may have more. Data processing really sits at the heart of what the GDPR is about. It's about keeping personal data only being processed in the way and for the things that that it was intended, that the data controller has said was part of the purpose. Now, if you look through this list of what you can or what is defined as being data processing, I've looked at this list must be 1,000 times now, and I genuinely can't think of anything that you can actually do to personal data or with personal data that wouldn't be considered to be data processing. So rather than dwell on the fact of, oh, we're only storing the data, and therefore, you know, we're not really processing it, we're just storing it, rather than trying to look for you know, loopholes like that, in actual fact, you're better off just to say, under the GDPR, if we're collecting personal data, then we have to make sure that we're processing it correctly, because the likelihood is we're going to be processing it in accordance with what the GDPR actually knows and believes. Okay, let's move on to the next one. We are talking now about consent. Okay, so consent is one of the legal bases for providing access, or for a data subject to provide access to their data. Now, there are 6 in total, okay, and I'll talk about some of the others. But for consent, it must be freely given, specific and informed indication by the data subject, signifying their agreement to their personal data being processed. Okay, and that's, consent must be positive, so it must be opt-in. So whereas before you've got away with having a pre-ticked tick box to say, yes, please send me an email once a month about the other services that I provide, in this instance, we can't do that. We have to make sure that the data subject is ticking that tick box themselves to say that they actually want to continue receiving marketing or other information for you. And while we're talking about marketing, whilst this is an HR orientated webinar, it's important to understand that marketing is actually the only function within your business function that's actually mentioned within the GDPR, within the basis or understanding of direct marketing. So your marketing colleagues, if they're not taking GDPR seriously and not in control of their GDPR requirements, might be an idea to just mention that to them, that marketing is actually directly mentioned within the GDPR. Okay, so this is one of the slides that that Chris was originally going to cover off, but I'll cover this one off to the best of my ability. This is how this is one of the screens here that is part of the Exede application. So where you're relying on consent from your employees, and that may be the basis on which you're getting their permission to process their data. your Exede helps you out a great deal by actually capturing and documenting that consent. And as you can see here, it's confirming who the individual is and also confirming that they're going to be responsible for maintaining their personal data, which is another requirement of the GDPR, that the personal data needs to be maintained and of high quality. Now, I mentioned that consent is only one of the legal bases for processing personal data. There's actually 6, including consent. So in looking at the types of data that you're processing, whether that be HR data or transactional data, look at the different types. Consent is a very, very powerful one, okay, but it does have one of the advantages or otherwise of putting the data subject wholly in control of that data, in that they can withdraw their consent at any point. Now you may say, oh, okay, well that's what we want. That's okay, and many different organisations will make many different decisions based on their interpretation of their requirements, or indeed their attitude to risk and to the way that they're processing the data. So all of those things are important for you to consider. Okay, and here we have the definition of a data controller. So the data controller is the person, company, or organisation who determines the purpose for the of the data being collected, of the personal data being collected. Now, a data controller is absolutely critical here, and for most HR departments, your organisation will be the data controller. If you are a third party providing HR services to another organisation, then you would be considered to be the data processor, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But in most cases, you're going to be the data controller. The data processor is, and indeed data sub-processors, are the people or companies who undertake processing on behalf of the data controller, but who are not the employees of the data controller. So it's very much actively a third party to the organisation who's processing the data on their behalf. Now, in an HR setting, the example that I tend to use here of a common data provider is if you have a third party who provides payroll services, for example. In that scenario, that organisation may be or if they're a third party, they will be a data processor on your behalf. Now, obviously, as part of the GDPR, you want to be limiting the number of times that you're extracting data and sharing data with organizations and third parties, because the more often that you do that, the more often, the more likely you are to be able to lose the data, or indeed perhaps email it to the wrong people if you're actually emailing data around. So examine closely how you're exporting data, when you're exporting data, and if there are safer or better ways to be doing that. And work with your data protection officer where that's appropriate to actually work out the best and safest ways to do this and to send data. Now, under the GDPR, data subjects have 8 rights. And these are the fundamental rights and aspects around GDPR. You know, aside from data privacy and data protection, really at the heart of the GDPR is the rights of the data subject. So making sure the data subject has the rights to take control, maintain control of their data throughout its life, and no matter who it's given to, they have the right to exert these rights back on the organisation. So I'm going to run through those quickly just to make sure that everyone has a good base level and understanding of those. So at the top, we have the right to be informed. Absolutely critical, and that's why you have your purposes, your privacy notices well defined to lay out what the purpose for collecting the personal data is. And as I said earlier on, you'll have a number of purposes defined, some for recruiting people, some for employing those people, some another one for transacting business with them, for example. And those privacy notices need to be displayed before you collect any personal data as well. So you're making sure that in accordance with the right to be informed, making sure that the data subject is well informed, well ahead of them actually providing the data. Now, there are some exceptions to that. One exception that I like to draw HR people's attention to specifically is if they're receiving a CV, for example, perhaps someone emails you directly, sending their CV. Very often a CV will have, of course, contact information and other personal information on there that you've had no opportunity to present that data subject with your privacy notice. Well, best practice around that would be to, in the acknowledgement of receipt of that CV, for example, to actually send a copy of your privacy notice back. So that the data subject can then say, oh, well, hold on a moment, they're going to hold on to my CV for 12 months. I didn't expect them to hold it that long. I withdraw my consent for them to use my data, and they send an email back saying, oh no, please delete this, I didn't realize. So it gives the options in that respect. Okay, so the right of access. I understand that Chris has actually joined the webinar, but he's only in listen-only mode at the moment. So, okay, well, we'll see what we can do about that as we go through. Given I'm already in the webinar at the moment, it's a bit difficult for me to alter that. So, let's look at the right of access. Now, as a data subject, you have the right to request a copy of the personal data that an organisation stores on you or stores about you. So, and that includes everyone who is a European resident has these rights. So, as an employee, for example, you can ask what data you have stored. An organisation is storing on you, but equally as a customer of an organisation, you have that right to inquire as to what information they hold on you. Now, there are some exceptions around that. I know that law firms, for example, will actively exclude any information that pertains to a legal case, for example. If someone's going through a divorce, for example, they can't write to their spouse's lawyer and perform a subject access request and find out all the information that their spouse has given about them to the lawyer. That, for example, wouldn't be permitted. The third right is the right to rectification. That's the right to correct the data. Any information that's held that's incorrectly by an organisation, a data subject has the right to have that corrected. And you have to have the processes, the business processes in place, both to recognise these rights and to enforce them too. And there's a tight time scales around these requests as well. They all have to be fulfilled within a month of their request. And the Information Commissioner's Office, who's the data protection authority here in the UK, has said that they won't be forgiving of organisations who can't process within a month just because they've had more requests than were expected, for example. Okay, you have to have the planning in place and to be responsive enough to be able to deal with subject access requests and other requests from data subjects. So the fourth right of the data subject is the right to erasure, or if you're over a certain age, other 1980s bans are available. Now, the right to erasure, sometimes called the right to be forgotten, is the right to have your data deleted by an organisation. Now, in an HR sense, this probably isn't going to happen whilst an employee is employed by a company for obvious reasons, but organisations do have the right to refuse the right to erasure. Now, in those specific cases, it will usually be because the data has to be held, or certain data has to be held for other purposes, such as the fulfillment of employment law or company law or anti-money laundering requirements, those kind of things. So a company does have the right to say no, and these are the reasons why we can't delete all of your data, or this is the data that we've deleted, but we can't remove this other data because of this. Okay, so you do have those rights, but generally speaking, you have to be able to fulfill the right to erasure. The next right is the right to restrict processing. So a data subject having asked for their data is able to then come back and say, well, not only have you got the data incorrect and I'm asking you to correct it, but until that data is corrected, I want you to restrict processing of that data. Now, in the scenario that we've spoken about here, in an HR scenario, the ideal is that you're actually granting access to your employees so they can update and maintain their own data. Very, very powerful when your systems do that, and I know that's a feature within Exede as well. But very, very powerful when you're able to push that that capability back to your employees or your data subjects, so that they are actually responsible for the maintenance of their data, of their their name, their address, and those other details. The next right is the right to data portability. Now, in an HR sense, I don't think there's really going to be much call for the right to data portability. There may be. I can see that in future, organisations may insist on individuals bringing a copy of their data with them when along with their P45 from their previous employer, for example. I can see that that developing, but at this point in time, there's no real right to data portability. Now, where I can see sectors that I believe will be most greatly affected. In the financial services sector, for example, we're all familiar with the comparison websites for any financial services virtually, for credit cards and for motor insurance, those kind of things. I can see those kinds of websites really having a field day with the right to data portability, because what it gives is the data subject the right to request an electronic copy of all of their personal data that's held by an organisation. So it's very, very similar to the right of access, but this allows the data subject to have an electronic copy of their personal data in an industry standard format. So that's perhaps XML or a CSV file, or if there's a particular format that's used by organizations, then it will be that particular format. The right to object is very similar to the right to restrict processing, and it really revolves around the fact that the data subject is not happy with the way that you're processing their data, either because they believe the data is incorrect or they believe you're processing it for a purpose other than what you stated or what they agreed to. So in this case, the data subject has the right to object to data processing. And that's likely to be used in conjunction with other, other rights being asserted, such as the right to rectification and the right to restrict processing, for example. And the final right is the right to manual processing. Now, again, I can't think of a very good example of where this would be used in HR. An example I've used previously is perhaps if you used an automated process, an algorithm, for example, to decide on to automatically decide on what basis people would be given a pay rise or a bonus or something like that. It may be that the amount of their bonus would be calculated, using a formula which took their current salary and their the number of days off sick they've had this year or something like that. Stretching the point a bit, but I'm sure you can understand the process that I'm talking about. In that case, if someone was unhappy with the calculation, they may object to to automated processing and may ask for their case to be looked at manually. Now, where I think this is, again, going to be more prevalent is with organisations who are financial services, for example, where individuals are applying for a loan or for a mortgage or something like that. And these days, as we probably all appreciate, a lot of that is automated and based on, credit records and things like that, but it's largely automated. I can very much see organisations having to perform manual reviews of these kinds of cases where someone believes that another John Smith down the road who has really bad credit is affecting their ability to get a mortgage, for example. And just a reminder, please do ask any questions as as we go along. We will be asking or answering those as we go through. I can see we've already had a number already in there, so thank you very much for that. Do please keep them coming. An important aspect around GDPR is really making sure that you're leveraging the advantages that your computer systems and your business processes, but really your computer systems, to make sure that they're making compliance easier. There are systems out there, and I'm sure we've all seen them, but there are systems out there that have obviously been invented long before GDPR that have no understanding of GDPR, or indeed, in some instances, the Data Protection Directive, particularly if they're coming from another part of the world that doesn't understand European regulations. So make sure that that your systems are making it as easy as possible, wherever possible, that they are recognizing and treating different data types and different purposes differently, and they're restricting access to personal data, in an appropriate way, on a role basis. Okay, and wherever possible, they're automatically enforcing policies such as data retention, because under the data, the GDPR, data can only be retained and stored and processed for a certain period of time. So make sure that your privacy policies state what your data retention period is, and that the privacy notices for hiring someone, for example, may say that you're only going to retain the data for 6 months or a year, depending on what you feel is appropriate for your organization. So make sure you've got those things. And here we've got another slide that demonstrates how Exede makes compliance easier and how it's helping you comply with the GDPR. And as you can see here, it's a roles-based security system, in allowing people to have the right kind of access at the right times, and being able to be limited. So you can see here that confidential information, I'm just going to pick on that one because it's a very good example, but confidential information is only accessible by by those two groups of people, the HR sysadmin and HR admin. So very tight lockdown there on confidential information, whereas other types of information have different rules, and that's exactly the way that it should be, exactly the kind of examples I was giving on the previous slide. Now, we spoke about third parties and data processors on one of the previous slides, and what we've got here is the whole reason why you need to be holding your vendors to account and understanding where the third parties are and who they are and what they're doing with your data, and with your employees' data as HR people. So vendors and suppliers, they're often, for HR departments at least, processing very personal information and sometimes sensitive personal information too. So you need to make sure that you've got contracts in place with your vendors, and that your vendor management system, so the process that you go through to ensure your vendors are delivering value and that they're delivering within the SLAs, the service level agreements that you're expecting. You need to make sure your vendor management process is holding your vendors to account and ensuring and checking their continued compliance with the GDPR. And this goes, hopefully you'll be making this linkage anyway from what we said earlier on, but this includes if they are based outside the EU, in fact, particularly if they're based outside the EU. So if, for example, you have an outsourced payroll process, and it's based in North America, for example, you need to have very strict contractual agreements in place to ensure that that North American company is complying with the GDPR and not putting your staff's data at risk. There are very few upsides to putting your staff's data at risk. It's not a good reputational story to be telling that one of the benefits is of joining the company is we'll lose your data. It's not so good. And here we go. This is how Exede demonstrate their compliance. So you would have recently received, or should have recently received, some information from Exede detailing exactly how they're using your data and showing how they're complying with the GDPR. Exactly the sort of thing that you need to be receiving from your other vendors, but also making sure that you've got the vendor management system to ensure to force them to provide such information, and that they're continuing to do a good job for you. Updates to your policies, processes and procedures. Now, you've probably all been going through the process, depending on where you are right at this point in time with GDPR. You've been going through the process of updating your policies and updating your processes, and probably updating your procedures as well to embed GDPR and the requirements of GDPR into your normal business practices. That really is the best practice around implementing these kinds of regulatory requirements. So make sure that if you haven't done that, that you've at least understand which policies, processes and procedures you're going to need to update, and don't delay on that, because whilst the Information Commissioner's Office and other data protection authorities around the world have said, or around Europe rather, have said it's going to be a soft landing for GDPR. What they're really saying there is, we want to see evidence that you are taking GDPR seriously, and if you are taking GDPR seriously, then we're going to give you perhaps a little bit of slack during, up until the latter half of 2018, but that's not going to extend forever. So they're just trying to make it clear that they're not going to jump on everyone on the 26th of May, and be doing dawn raids on the 26th of May, just to, try and catch people out. That's not the way that they're going to be working. Although, under GDPR, the ICO does have the right to come and ask an organisation to demonstrate their GDPR compliance. That's another big change from the Data Protection Directive, actually. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see there's 4 policies that I've listed out there. They're sort of the minimum ones I would expect you to have in place that directly relate to the GDPR. So they're not necessarily fully HR orientated, so there'll be others that will be impacted, but these 4 are the absolute minimum that you should have in place, and you should be reviewing to ensure that they are GDPR compliant. Now, as HR people, many of you won't have had I was going to say pleasure, but it's not really the right word, but you won't have had the pleasure of having to deal with a data breach. I've had that dubious pleasure on numerous occasions, not for FISTEP, I hasten to add, but on behalf of FISTEP clients. And it's really not a pleasant experience. Everyone's very busy, very often trying to work out whether the data breach is still ongoing, whether it's a hack underway, or what the nature of the data breach is, and things like that. So having a data breach plan in place is an absolute must, doubly so when GDPR comes into enforcement, because you have 72 hours. Okay, just let that land, 72 hours. Now, that's not 72 business hours, so the clock doesn't stop at 6 o'clock and then restart again at 8 or 9 o'clock the following morning. It's 72 hours from the point of the breach, the personal data breach being discovered. Okay, and during that period you have to perform triage, so understand what the nature of the breach is, stop the breach if it's still ongoing, make sure that it's not the data still isn't leaking out of the building. Establish the scope and size of the data breach, so how many records were stolen, what type of records were they, was it all personal data, was there any sensitive personal data in there? You also have to assess the impact on the data subjects. You have to notify the Data Protection Authority, so the Information Commissioner's Office in this case. And you also, depending on the nature of the data breach, are likely to have to notify the data subjects too. So let's just compare that to some of the more recent data breaches that we're probably all aware of. Let's use the Equifax one as an example. I like to use that one as an example because it's the complete opposite of what you should do, really. The Equifax breach didn't concentrate on HR data specifically, so before you're scratching your head trying to recall that one. It did, however, result in the breach of 160 million adults' personal data being released. And Equifax didn't make this information available to those data subjects for 6 months. Okay, so not 72, well, not even 72 days, you know, it was 6 months. So not 72 hours, not even 72 days, but 6 months before information started to creep out about the fact that there had been this breach. So don't follow the Equifax example. You need to have a data breach plan in place. If it's not something you've done before, if it's not something you've got in place now, obviously reach out to Fifth Step. We're here to help with this. We've done a lot of this kind of work. We understand what needs to go in there. We can help you with that kind of thing. Being able to demonstrate that you've got a GDPR project in place, as I said earlier on, is absolutely key to being able to defend yourself against the Data Protection Authority. So when, Chris, you've just joined. Excellent news.
Yeah, I'm joined as a panelist now. That's great. Thanks, Darren. I'll step in 1 second. That's great. Well done.
Great. Yes, making sure that you've got a project running. It's absolutely critical that you do that, because the Information Commissioner's Office, as I said earlier on, will go easier on you if you're actually able to demonstrate that you're taking the GDPR seriously. Okay, if you're not doing that, you're not able to demonstrate that, they'll assume that you have no respect for the GDPR, and the fines will be that heavier for you, even in the soft landing phase. So make sure you're able to demonstrate it. But also, just to be clear, GDPR isn't a one-off project. It's not a one and done. Okay, you're going to need to keep compliant, and that means that every change to an HR system that's done, you need to be looking at what the implications are for you, or a change to a business process or an HR process. You're going to need to think about what the consequences are there to the GDPR compliance. So make sure that you've got that and you're considering that, and it's becoming part of your normal project management process. So before we move on to questions, I'm going to give Chris an opportunity. And Chris, if you need me to step back to any of the slides that I spoke to, the Exede slides earlier on, but I thought I'd give you the opportunity to do a far better job to describe some of the aspects of how Exede helps its clients comply
Darren,
with things
thank
like
you very much
GDPR.
indeed. Could you go back to the slide which shows the data subject's rights?
Absolutely.
So this is a really valuable slide, because this is what all the data owners need to decide what rights they're going to give to the data subjects. And we in Exede, as a data processor, can help our clients enable those rights. There are a few in here that are quite interesting ones. So the right to be informed. So that is about making sure you get consent from the data subjects, from your employees, from applicants, to actually store and use their data for the appropriate purposes. You can do that in a number of ways, such as contracts of employment. But in terms of system access, our system can enable you to get their consent when they first log into the system. What you might want to consider is actually obtaining that consent every year. And that's something that's very easy to do with an Exede, by actually switching off the consent tick box and getting people, and the next time they log in, to actually give their consent on an annual basis, something you may want to consider. In terms of the right to rectification, if you're using the Exede self-service, then actually you can give the individuals, the employees, the data subjects, the responsibility for actually managing and maintaining their own personal data. And then that takes the onus off you as an HR department for actually maintaining the data is accurate and up to date. You can pass that responsibility over to your employees to make sure they manage, maintain their information accurate and up to date, such as their contact details, next of kin address details. And that will take a lot of workload off your shoulders. In terms of the right to erasure, that is where you need to have the policies around data retention, how long you're going to hold that data for, and at what point does it need to get erased. and I know that certain organizations do have to hold that data for certain lengths of time. And things to consider, for example, is that if you have got a complex disciplinary or complex grievance that may, for example, include damages and claims and everything else, you might have to hold that data legally for longer than you may for other employees. So there's a piece to consider around that. In terms of the right to restrict processing, in the UK, certainly most organizations would require all employees to have their data processed in a consistent way so they can manage their employees for HR and payroll related purposes. But I know that in certain organizations, such as over in Germany or France, we have works councils, is the works councils may actually restrict some of the data processing and actually have to obtain the consent from the employees. So those are some of the things to consider with them. I think those are the main ones that I wanted to bring out, Darren. Do you have any questions from the audience that you want to open up now? And either you or myself can then go and answer those.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as we start to enter into questions, please do, a quick reminder, it's not too late to ask questions, so please type those in, busy typing away. So we just head to the question slide. Very, very quickly, quick shameless plug. If you need to have more information, then there's lots of different sources. I wrote the book, The Little Book of GDPR, which was a #1 bestseller in the business law category on Amazon. And still it hasn't been out of the top 10 in that category since I released it, so please do feel free to go and look at that. Also, there's lots of podcasts and blogs and videos available from the Fifth Step website. Please do visit, listen to those. They're all made available free, and this webinar will actually be made available on those same channels as well. And then we move on to contact details. So there's my contact details. Please do reach out. Follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and do contact us if you've got any questions. And likewise, you perhaps already have Chris's contact details, but there they are. And time has run out for you. If you've asked your questions, then let's try and get those answered. So. First one on the list here is from Lisa. Does GDPR stop companies from selling data to other companies for marketing purposes and cold calling? Yes, it does, Lisa, in as much as if that's not the purpose for which you agreed to the processing of that information, the personal data cannot be used in that way. And as I said earlier on, you perhaps asked the question before I mentioned this, direct marketing and marketing in general is the only business function that's actually mentioned directly in the GDPR. Okay, next question here. Should we provide a privacy notice with contracts of employment? Yes, that's probably a good best practice. Your privacy notices definitely ought to be updated and part of your employee handbook and other documentation. So they should be very accessible to staff and the data subjects. So as a best practice, that's not a bad one to include your privacy notice.
And Darren, I'd recommend a couple of areas where it'd be appropriate to do that. Firstly, for recruitment and applicants, you need to decide how long you want to hold or is appropriate to hold applicant data. The approach we're adopting with Exede is that we will hold applicant data for 1 year, and after that point, we will then erase the data. But if a candidate applies for another role in the meantime, then the clock will start ticking again from when they reapply for the next role. The other reason is that we don't believe that actually after a year, their CV really is accurate and up to date enough, and we'd much rather have a fresh CV to start again. So that's our approach, but every organization and data control need to decide the appropriate duration for holding that data. The second area is when people leave the organization, you should let people know how long you're going to retain that data for. That's a decision you need to take, and you may need to get legal advice because, as I mentioned earlier, some organizations may need to hold data for longer. The principle that we're adopting within Exede, I'm not saying it's the principle that everyone should adopt, the principle we're adopting is that on the 3rd anniversary of the tax year, we'll erase the data. And that is because HMRC related data has to be held for at least 3 years. So we will hold it for 3 years up until the next tax year.
Good stuff, Chris. Thanks very much. We do actually have a best practice guide around HR and HR data retention. If anyone's interested in receiving that, do please drop me a mail at info@fifthstep.com, and I'll be very happy to send that on to you. Okay, then next question. How detailed does a privacy notice need to be? Do we need to list each piece of data and the basis for processing each one? No, you don't need to go down to that level, not down to each individual piece of information. You need to be able to defend exactly why you're asking for all of the information if that became a question, but you don't need to go down into that level of detail within the privacy notice. You should, however, within the privacy notice, be able to note that you are processing personal information and sensitive personal information, if that's the case, the reasons why, and the retention policies, and who is going to be processing it and where it's going to be processed. So if you're having the data processed by third parties, you should be listing those third parties and also where it's going to be processed. So if it's being processed in in another country or something like that, then you need to list that. And you also need to list the contacts for your data protection officer. Now, if you don't have a data protection officer, and most organizations on this call probably do, but if you don't have a data protection officer but you think you might need one, then do speak to Fifth Step, as we have a very good way of providing those on a flexible and fractional basis, which makes it a very cost-effective way of doing so. Okay, next question is, in regards to the retention of records, if you keep things for, say, 6 months and then you ask for a copy of the records held, what can you say? Would this be part of an induction notice as a new employee or a leaver process? So yeah, I think Chris has probably covered and answered that question in his previous answer. But if you do get a request and you've got the information for 6 months, the great news is that you've already told the data subject that you're going to retain their data for for at least 6 months, if that's the case, as part of the privacy notice. So if you've retained that information, then that's fantastic. If they come to you within 6 months and they ask what information you've got, you let them know what information you've got. If they say, I didn't realize you were going to keep it for 6 months, you direct them to their to your privacy policy and your privacy notice, and you're all good. Okay. Question here from Claire about recruitment. If agencies are being utilized for this service, okay, would we still be required to acknowledge the candidate's information with a processing acknowledgement offering the candidate the right to withdraw content? No, in that specific instance, you probably wouldn't. It may still be a best practice, and you're not necessarily stopped from doing that. It may still be a best practice, but your expectation there is that that information has been communicated via the agent. So you should ensure that that information is presented in one form or another. But given that you're being provided the information by in that instance a third party, they have to also make sure that the retention policies are communicated. So as a best practice, probably best to make sure, but you're not necessarily forced to do it that way, would be my immediate recommendation.
Darren,
okay,
that's quite an interesting one. And Darren?
Yeah.
Darren, just on using agencies, what you can do in terms of your consent from applicants, you can say that we're going to be using your data for recruitment purposes, which may include passing your data, to agencies, or actually, no, the other way around. If agencies are passing data to Exede, the agency would need to get their consent to pass your data on to their client. So they may need to specify more details in their consent notice.
Yeah, that's right. If they're relying on consent, that's definitely the case. They will probably be relying on another basis for processing it. But if they're relying on consent, absolutely, and ideally they'd be presenting that information back to you. Okay, next question. Is there any standard retention period for HR data and personal data? No, there's not a standard. As I mentioned earlier on, there is a best practice guide that Fifth Step and Exede put together last year, end of last year, wasn't it, Chris? We put that together. So we've got that information. As I said earlier on, I'm more than happy to send that out and provide access to that. Just drop an email through to info@fifthstep.com and we'll make sure that happens for you. And the final question, unless anyone gets in very quickly, will we be held to account if our recruitment agencies breach data of our candidates? Is it our responsibility to ensure our recruitment agencies are compliant? That's a really good question. Okay, it very much depends on the relationship that you have and who is the data controller and who is the data processor. It could well be that you are joint data processors, okay, because you've actually engaged them to conduct a business process on your behalf. They've defined some of the information that they need and you've defined other information. So it could be a joint data controller, but either way, one of you is going to be the data processor and one's going to be the data controller. But if they are acting on your instruction, likelihood is you're the data controller, or at least partially so. And if they breach the data, okay, then it's not going to be, the consent model wouldn't have been fulfilled. That's going to be a really tricky one. I don't think you're going to be accountable there, because actually if they breach the data, you won't have necessarily have the full candidate information there, and the candidates are applying for a job with you, but they may be applying to a job with a number of other organizations as well. So I would say that in that scenario that you wouldn't be held accountable, and actually be the recruiter who was accountable. If, however, another third party were to lose data, such as a payroll company, I've used that example a number of times. If they lose your data, then you are both liable and responsible under GDPR. So you can both be fined and held responsible for that. And the data controller is always responsible. Another reason why you need to ensure your vendor management system and processes are well maintained and in place. Well, I'd like to thank everyone today. Chris, do you have any final closing thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Darren. That's really kind of putting that in context. And for our own clients who are attending our user group session next week, we'll go through this in more detail around how our product enables you to be compliant. And we'll have a follow-up webinar for those who cannot attend and those who are interested in seeing in more detail with those details. So looking forward to everyone who wants to join that. And once again, I'd like to say thank you very much to Darren for giving today's presentation and for his thought leadership and expertise around GDPR. So thanks so much, Darren.
You're very welcome, Chris, and the audience. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Thanks very much.